Okay, let's take a look at seasonality with regards to the penguin population. So this is a penguin population in Australia, so we know it's Southern Hemisphere data, it's monthly data, and it's the number of penguins in the colony. If we take a look at the trend over the long period of time, we see that the long-term trend starts around 600 in 2000 and finishes off at about 418 in 2007. So we know that generally overall, over the long term, the trend is decreasing. And we've got the fairly significant drop sort of in this area here that we will probably want to talk about, because generally the population was fairly steady until about 2003, and then in 2003 something happened and we had a fairly significant drop in the population. And then it pretty much leveled out after that, but never recovered. It basically stayed the same at that point. So that's what's happening in the trend. And we'll look at the seasonal effects, and we can see that there's peaks and troughs and peaks and troughs. So we have a seasonal effect going on, and our seasonal graph confirms that, right? So we do have a fairly regular seasonal pattern. Every year seems to be doing pretty much the same thing, which is basically you've got this W shape, where you've got a bit of a peak in the first month of January, and then it steadily drops until it sort of bottoms out in in March, the third month. Then it sort of does this recovery after March. May it peaks, and then we have a very sharp, between May and June, we have a very sharp decline in the population. And then so that June is basically our lowest month, our lowest trough, if you would like to say that. And then again, it just steadily increases over the next several months until it peaks at its highest peak, which is in December. So that's generally what's happening. It's got kind of this W shape, and you might want to speak to that. General, from the very beginning to the very end, you might want to speak to that. But the most important part at the achieve level, now remember, this is the achieve level here, peaks and trough time periods identified with average values given including units. So in this graph right here is where our average values are. This is our average seasonal effect. So we can, having made that statement perhaps, then we can talk about the lowest peak being in June, and it's where it is. It's approximately maybe 340 penguins below the trend line, below what you expect it to be. And the highest peak is in December, and that's about 440 penguins above the trend line, what we, in other words, above what we would expect it to be. Now, at this point, it would be very useful if you could give meanings to those, if you could find some research. So we've covered the achieve by talking about the peaks and troughs or time periods. We've talked about monthly data. We've talked about penguin numbers, and we've done the average values and then given including units, right? So we've done that. Now, if we can then do that, and then sort of link this a little bit to research and some meaning as to why these things are happening. So at this point, you might be able to find something. You could make it up, I realize, but you could maybe find that maybe in June, penguins are no longer in the colony. They're out at sea feeding or whatever. And in June, which is kind of in Southern Hemisphere, a little bit colder months, maybe that's better for fishing. And then in December, you've got this steady increase, maybe because of birds are coming back, they're nesting, they're breeding, and so we've got this peak in the population in December, and maybe that's when all the penguins are back. They've had chicks, and now the population is quite high. So that's a big tick for the merit part, where you can say about the values, and you can also give some meaning. And then, if you want to get into the excellence realm, we have to start having a little bit more in-depth conversation about this graph on the left. So, peaks and troughs, periods identified with average values, blah, 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 blah. But the seasonal plot discussed including confirmation of trend, and again, linked to research. So this is where we will talk about the fact that almost all the years are following this sort of W pattern, where we have sort of a peak in the first month of January, then another peak in January, February, March, April, May, I guess it is. We have another peak in May, and then a big decline, which happens in June. And then we have the steady increase until we sort of max out the population in December in the 12th month. And every year is pretty much following that pattern. We have this gap here that we've talked about. And so if we take a look, this is around 2005, 2004, these blue lines here. And then this is about 2000, this red line. And there's this gap. Now, it would be good to talk to that gap. And the gap basically suggests that the population was fairly high here and then did this big nosedive around here. Well, guess what? That's this, right? So that's that nosedive. And that happens between 2003 and 2004, halfway through 2004. So that's what's being reflected here. You've got this big decline. Now, we don't know what the event was that caused that big decline. It could be scarcity of fish. It could be a really bad storm that came in and killed a lot of the birds or whatever, or a disease. And so we would need to talk about that over here in this place here. We would also want to say that the lines themselves, the years going from light to dark, right? So lighter lines on the top, darker lines on the bottom, that confirms the trend, which is basically to confirm that the trend generally is decreasing. And so that's the kind of thing that you do. And again, if you can link to research or to this is what you expect to happen, to have this big decrease during this month and this big increase here in December, because my research says so, or my research may go against this of what we're seeing here. But in order to get to the next step, you need to be able to link this back to your research. And you need to talk about how this confirms, this coloring and so on, confirms that whole idea around a decreasing trend.